You ever notice how the world treats silence? When you were quiet, they thought you were weak. When you stayed to yourself, they called you invisible. No applause, no attention, no respect. Just background noise in a world full of loud, desperate voices. But here's the funny thing, real power doesn't make noise. It studies. It watches. It waits. And while they were busy laughing, judging, overlooking you, you were becoming something they couldn't understand. Now look at them. Suddenly, they're watching. Every move, every word, every step you take. Not because they care, but because they're confused. Because the person they ignored is now the one they can't ignore. Isn't it ironic? They created the silencer, but now they're terrified of what grew inside it. So go ahead, keep watching. Because this time, the quiet one isn't disappearing. He's just getting started. Silence is not weakness. It's preparation. People misunderstand silence because they've been trained to believe that value only exists when it is visible, when it is loud, when it is constantly proving itself to an audience that doesn't even care to understand it. But silence is never empty. It is never absence. It is storage. It is where thoughts sharpen without interruption, where observation becomes deeper than participation, where a mind starts learning how the world actually moves instead of how it pretends to move in front of crowds. When someone is quiet, the world assumes they are gone. But in reality, they are just no longer wasting energy on being understood by the wrong people. Silence is where patterns are studied without interference. You start noticing what others miss because you are not busy trying to be noticed yourself. Every conversation around you becomes information instead of distraction. Every insult becomes data. Every moment of being ignored becomes space to understand why people behave the way they do when they think no one important is watching them. And that is the part they always forget. While they are busy performing, there is someone in the background actually learning. Not reacting, not rushing. Just absorbing everything like it all matters, because eventually it does. People call it being slow. People call it being left behind. But they only say that because they cannot see what is forming underneath the surface. Preparation does not look like success. Preparation looks like repetition. It looks like solitude. It looks like nights where nothing seems to be happening, but everything is being built internally. A mind in preparation does not announce itself. It does not ask for permission. It does not seek validation from those who are still busy laughing at what they do not understand. It simply continues, quietly, consistently, almost like it is invisible on purpose. And that is where the real shift begins. When silence stops being something forced on you and starts becoming something you control. At first, people ignore you because they think you have nothing to say. Later, you stay silent because you realize most things do not need to be said. There is a difference between being unheard and choosing not to be part of noise that leads nowhere. Silence becomes discipline. It becomes distance. It becomes a way of protecting energy from being scattered into places that cannot return anything meaningful. In that space, awareness grows sharper. You begin to see who people really are when they are not performing for attention. You notice how quickly respect changes when attention shifts. You realize how fragile most opinions are, how easily they are formed and just as easily replaced. And while others are busy trying to control perception, you are learning reality. That difference is everything. Preparation in silence also builds control over reaction. When you are not constantly responding to every comment, every challenge, every attempt to provoke you, you begin to operate differently. You don't move emotionally, you move strategically. You don't rush to defend yourself, because you understand that time reveals more truth than arguments ever will. Silence removes the need to prove what is already in progress. It strips away urgency and replaces it with timing. There is also something unsettling about a person who does not react the way others expect. People become used to predictable responses. They expect noise when they throw noise. They expect collapse when they apply pressure. But silence interrupts that pattern. It creates uncertainty. It makes others question what they are actually dealing with, because there is no feedback loop for them to feed on. And in that uncertainty, power shifts quietly without announcement. What they call invisibility is often just incubation. Everything important develops away from observation first. No one sees roots forming underground, but they support everything that will eventually stand above it. Silence works the same way. It is not empty, it is concentrated. It is not lack of progress, it is progress without spectators. And spectators are often the first to be shocked when something finally breaks through the surface. Because they assumed nothing was happening simply, because they were not watching it closely enough. And while they continue to underestimate what silence holds, it continues building something they will eventually have to look at without understanding how it got there. Being ignored builds unseen power in ways most people never recognize until it is already too late for them to react to it. At first, being ignored feels like absence, like something has been taken away from you, like your presence carries no weight in the spaces you enter. People don't respond, they don't acknowledge, they don't adjust their behavior around you, and that creates an illusion that you are not important in the structure of things. But what they fail to understand is that attention is not always a sign of power. Sometimes it is just distraction, aimed at keeping you busy, while nothing real is forming underneath. And when that attention is removed, what remains is the raw space where actual development begins without interference or distortion. When no one is watching you, you stop performing. You stop adjusting your identity based on reactions. You stop filtering your thoughts through the approval of people who were never invested in your growth in the first place. And in that absence of observation, something subtle starts happening. Your focus becomes internal instead of external. Your decisions stop being emotional responses to how others perceive you and start becoming structured moves based on what you are actually trying to build. That shift alone creates an advantage most people never get, because they are too addicted to being seen. Even when being seen is slowing them down, being ignored forces observation in return. When you are not the center of attention, you become the observer. You start noticing how people behave when they don't think you matter in the room, how quickly they reveal their real intentions when they assume there is no consequence, how opinions shift depending on who is listening and who is not. That kind of awareness cannot be taught through theory. It only comes from distance, from being placed in a position where you are not part of the performance, but still present enough to see everything clearly. And once you see people without the filter of how they present themselves to you directly, you start understanding how shallow most reactions really are. There is also a transformation that happens in discipline when you are ignored. Without external validation, there is no immediate reward for effort, which means anything you continue doing is no longer driven by applause or recognition, but by internal structure. That is where real consistency is built, because consistency that depends on attention collapses the moment attention disappears. But consistency built in silence becomes independent of environment. It continues even when no one is checking, even when no one is expecting anything, even when the outcome feels invisible for long periods of time. That invisibility is where endurance is trained without pressure from outside voices. People often underestimate what they cannot measure in real time. If they cannot see progress, they assume it is not happening. But most meaningful development does not produce immediate visible change. It accumulates quietly, like pressure building under a surface that looks unchanged until it is not. And during that accumulation phase, being ignored becomes an advantage because it removes interruption. There are no opinions slowing decisions down, no external noise forcing unnecessary adjustments, no need to explain movements that are still in formation. Everything stays protected in its raw state until it is strong enough to exist without explanation. What makes this even more powerful is how being ignored reshapes motivation itself. At some point, the desire to be seen starts to fade, not because it is destroyed, but because it becomes irrelevant. When you spend enough time building without acknowledgement, your reference point shifts from how others see you to how far you have actually progressed compared to your own previous position. That internal measurement replaces external validation. And once that replacement happens, control over direction becomes much more stable, because it is no longer affected by shifting attention cycles or temporary recognition patterns that come and go without consistency. And while all of this is developing quietly, those who ignored you remain locked in the assumption that nothing significant is happening, because nothing is being presented to them in a way they are used to responding to, which is where the misunderstanding grows deeper, and more permanent observation is a silent weapon that most people underestimate, because it does not look like action from the outside, but in reality, it is one of the most powerful forms of control a person can develop over time. While others are busy reacting, speaking, and trying to be understood, the observer is collecting patterns, studying behavior, and building an internal map of how people and situations actually function when stripped of performance. Observation does not require attention to be effective. It requires distance, patience, and the ability to stay still while everything around you reveals itself without knowing it is being studied. When you observe instead of react, you begin to see what others miss completely. You notice inconsistencies in speech, contradictions in behavior, and the difference between what people say and what they repeatedly do. Most people only process surface-level communication. They hear words and respond to words, but they never analyze the structure underneath those words, the intent behind them, or the patterns that repeat across different situations. Observation changes that completely, because it forces you to slow down mentally while everything else moves fast around you. And in that slowdown you gain clarity that reactive thinking can never provide. There is also a shift that happens in emotional control when observation becomes a habit. Instead of immediately responding to provocation, you begin to register it first, analyze it, and then decide if it even deserves a reaction. That space between stimulus and response is where control exists, and most people never develop it because they are trained to respond instantly to everything. But the observer breaks that cycle by refusing to be controlled by impulse. Nothing forces them into automatic reaction anymore, because everything is filtered through awareness before action is taken. Observation also exposes truth in ways conversation never can. People often construct identities through language. They present versions of themselves that are curated for acceptance, but their real patterns emerge when they stop thinking they are being analyzed. In those unguarded moments, their behavior becomes consistent in ways their words are not. The observer notices this gap, the difference between presentation and reality, and that gap becomes the source of understanding most people never reach because they are too involved in the interaction to step outside of it. Mentally over time, observation turns into anticipation. Once you understand how patterns repeat, you begin to predict outcomes before they happen, not because of assumption, but because of recognition. You have seen similar behavior enough times to understand where it leads. That ability creates a kind of silent advantage, because while others are reacting to events as they unfold, you are already aware of what those events are likely to become. This is where observation transforms from passive watching into strategic awareness, where nothing is random anymore, only unstudied by those who are experiencing it for the first time. And while most people seek to be heard, the observer seeks to understand. That difference changes everything about how they move in the world. They are not distracted by the need to respond to everything. They are not pulled into every conversation, every opinion, every emotional wave that passes through their environment. Instead, they remain in a position where information flows toward them naturally, because silence combined with awareness creates space for truth to surface without resistance. The longer observation continues, the more invisible it becomes to those who are being observed. People rarely consider that they are revealing themselves constantly through small behaviors, repetition, and unconscious habits. They think they are only being seen when they choose to present themselves, but in reality, they are being revealed continuously through patterns they do not notice. The observer becomes fluent in these patterns, not by asking questions, but by watching long enough for answers to form on their own. And in that quiet space, where reaction is replaced with awareness, control stops being something forced and starts becoming something natural, because nothing is rushed anymore, nothing is assumed prematurely, and everything is understood before it is acted upon. Growth happens away from attention, not under it, and that is something most people only understand when they finally experience what it means to develop without anyone clapping, watching, or even acknowledging that anything is changing at all. Attention feels powerful at first because it gives validation, it creates the illusion of progress, and it makes movement feel meaningful simply because it is being seen. But attention also interrupts, it distorts. It pulls focus outward when real growth requires everything to be directed inward, where no one is interfering with the process or reshaping it for their own interpretation. When growth happens in private, it is not influenced by expectations. There is no pressure to perform at a certain level for an audience, no need to match a version of yourself that others have already decided they want to see. Instead, development becomes raw and unfiltered. Mistakes are made without judgment, corrections are applied without explanation, and progress is measured internally rather than externally. That kind of environment allows real transformation because it removes the fear of being seen as unfinished. And most people never improve fully because they are too afraid of looking incomplete, while still in the process, away from attention. Discipline becomes more honest. There is no external reminder to stay consistent, no one checking progress, no one rewarding effort. If something continues in that space, it is only because it is being maintained internally, which makes it stronger than anything driven by external motivation. Motivation that depends on recognition disappears when recognition is gone. But discipline that is built in silence continues regardless of whether anyone notices or not. That is where true stability and growth is formed, in environments where nothing is guaranteed except the effort you choose to maintain. There is also something important about the absence of comparison during private growth. When you are not constantly exposed to other people's progress, achievements, or opinions, your focus shifts away from competition and back to construction. You stop measuring yourself against others who are in different stages, different environments, and different timelines. Instead, you begin measuring yourself against your own previous version. That internal comparison is far more accurate because it reflects actual progress, rather than emotional reaction to external highlights. Growth away from attention also removes distraction in a way that is often underestimated. Attention comes with noise, opinions, interference, and constant evaluation. Even positive attention can become a burden because it pulls energy into maintaining perception rather than improving substance. When that noise is removed, mental space expands. Decisions become clearer. Focus becomes deeper. There is no need to justify every move or explain every change, which allows more energy to be directed into actual development instead of managing perception. In that quiet environment, patience becomes part of the structure. Without visible results being demanded by others, time is no longer treated as pressure, but as part of the process. You begin to understand that meaningful change is not immediate and that the most stable forms of growth require repetition over long periods without interruption. That understanding removes urgency, and in removing urgency, it removes mistakes that come from rushing. What remains is consistency built at a steady pace that does not collapse under external expectation. Most people misunderstand this phase because from the outside it looks like nothing is happening. They assume that visibility equals progress and invisibility equals stagnation, but real development does not require observation to exist. It continues regardless of whether it is acknowledged. In fact, many of the strongest changes happen precisely because they are not being interrupted by outside influence. No adjustments made to impress, no shifts made to satisfy, only pure construction based on internal direction. And while others are busy building for attention, those growing away from it are building something that does not depend on it at all. Success forcing attention from doubters is one of the most unavoidable truths in human behavior because people rarely believe in what they cannot immediately recognize, and even more rarely respect what they previously dismissed. At the beginning, doubt feels like a barrier, like a wall of opinions trying to define your limits before you even reach them. People decide too early who you are, what you can do, and how far you can go, not based on evidence, but based on what they are used to seeing from others in similar positions. That is where doubt starts, in familiarity, not reality. When someone is building in silence, doubt becomes louder around them, because there is nothing visible yet to contradict it. Silence is often mistaken for lack of progress, and lack of recognition is interpreted as lack of value. People become comfortable in underestimating what they do not see evolving in real time, and they form conclusions that feel correct to them simply because they are not being challenged by results yet. But doubt is temporary by nature. It only exists in the gap between unseen effort and visible outcome, and that gap always closes eventually. Success changes perception instantly, not gradually in the minds of those who doubted you. The same people who ignored your process begin to reinterpret your journey after the result becomes visible. What was once considered unlikely suddenly becomes obvious. What was once dismissed as unrealistic is reframed as inevitable. This shift does not happen because they gained new understanding, but because they are now forced to align their perception with reality. Evidence overrides assumption, and visibility overrides opinion. There is also a psychological reversal that happens when success finally appears. Doubt that once felt external starts turning inward for those who underestimated you. They begin to question their own judgment, their own ability to read situations, and their own confidence in predicting outcomes. Because nothing challenged a person's assumptions more than watching them collapse in front of evidence they did not expect. And in that moment, attention shifts, not out of admiration at first, but out of disbelief. Because the outcome does not match the narrative they built. Success also forces attention, because it disrupts control over the narrative. While you were unnoticed, others could define you freely without contradiction. They could assume, interpret, and label without resistance. But once results appear, that control disappears. The narrative is no longer stable in their hands because reality is now visible, and reality cannot be shaped as easily as opinion. That is why success is not just achievement. It is correction. It forces the environment to update its understanding, whether it wants to or not over time. Attention from doubters becomes unavoidable because success removes the option of ignoring. People can ignore effort. They can ignore silence. They can ignore potential. But they cannot ignore results that are clearly visible. Results demand acknowledgement even from those who resisted believing in them. And this acknowledgement often comes with discomfort because it forces people to confront the difference between what they assumed and what actually happened. There is also a strange shift that occurs in perception of time. The same period that was once used to dismiss you is later reinterpreted as the time you were building. The narrative changes after success arrives, but the facts never changed. Only the recognition of those facts did. That is why success feels like forcing attention, because it retroactively reshapes how everything leading up to it is viewed. Even by those who were not paying attention while it was happening, and once success becomes visible, attention is no longer something you chase or avoid. It becomes something that simply follows the outcome, whether it was expected or not.